John Lennon famously said, "Before Elvis, there was nothing."
He was the man who started it all, and nearly 45 years after he left us, he's still the one true king of rock and roll.
He's the germinated seed that sprouted what we now know as rock and roll music.
He changed the face of not just the music, but culture across the world. And it's still different now because of what Elvis did.
Much more than an uncontrollable pelvis and smouldering good looks, he became an icon of the 20th century. And tonight, we're going to count down the top 30 moments that made up his amazing life.
He was one of the most beautiful men to have walked the earth. He had the most extraordinary talent, fabulous voice, and amazing charisma.
Elvis has touched most people's lives in some way or other, and that's really what it's all about.
Early on, he caused outrage in conservative Middle America as they settled down to watch grainy black and white footage of hip-boggling performances like this.
It was straight to you, Mr. and Mrs. Middle America.
It made Elvis the topic of conversation everywhere.
And when he seemed washed up, he returned as a double leather-clad rock god, belting out his timeless tunes to a new generation of adoring fans in the most memorable comeback ever.
We're still talking about Elvis today because he's the greatest pop star, rock star of all time, and will never be overtaken.
On January the 8th, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis Aaron Presley entered the world.
Elvis Presley was born in a shed, literally a shed.
This is back when I was what they used to call hard scrabble. I mean, really dirt poor, farming sort of people, and you couldn't even call it farming.
Growing up in Tupelo didn't provide much in the way of entertainment for the boy who would be king.
His only entertainment was what he heard on a radio and in churches, because that's really what Tupelo, Mississippi was all about.
What came through, particularly in the early days, was his love of music, and he absorbed all music.
But in 1948, the family made a decision that would have a huge influence on Elvis's life. They left Tupelo behind and headed for the big city, Memphis.
Elvis's family were so poor, they lived among the black community, and the black community became his friends, and he listened to their music and he liked it. So to him, mixing with the black community was the way he grew up.
Memphis was then home to one of the biggest jazz and blues music scenes in the US. At its heart was the famous Beale Street, and to the young Elvis, it was the only place to be.
He went where ordinary white kids wouldn't go. Beale Street at that time was a totally black area. And I remember talking to Ike Turner, and he said that it was amazing that this white kid would actually come and watch him perform along Beale Street. But he had to go through the back door because he couldn't be seen in amongst the black audience.
From such humble beginnings to finding his musical nirvana in Memphis, the Elvis legend was already taking shape.
The poverty, the dirt poorness, he came from somewhere, and in a way you were therefore identifying with him. Even when it goes wrong, you're identifying with someone who's managed to claw his way up out of nowhere.
There are so many sort of serendipitous moments, I think, in a musician's journey. And I think the big one for Elvis was meeting Sam Phillips.
Sam Phillips owned a small recording studio in downtown Memphis, Sun Studios.
Sun Records was an old disused garage. They made their money through recording bar mitzvahs, funeral services.
Sam Phillips's passion was recording music, and he became one of the first white Southerners to record groundbreaking black artists of the day, like B.B. King. But in a time rife with racial tensions, black artists didn't sell records.
He knew what he wanted, the legendary line about the white boy that could sing like a black man.
That was how racist things certainly were then. If you wanted to sell to a white audience, you needed a white face.
And in the summer of 1953, a local employee of the Crown Electric Company, who fancied himself a bit of a singer, happened to be passing.
He was walking past Sun Studios, and you could make a record there for a couple of bucks. So he went in there and he recorded a song for his mum.
The song Elvis chose was a hit previously recorded by Ella Fitzgerald, My Happiness, and his poignant rendition with its smooth vocals and simple guitar accompaniment showed tantalizing glimpses of what was to come.
How I long to be with you, my happiness.
The girl who worked for Sam Phillips, who did his audition for him, made him a record, gave him his record to go off and give it to his mum. She then went straight into Sam Phillips. She said, "You got to listen to this guy."
But it wasn't until a few months later that Elvis was called back to the studios to audition for another record.
There were a couple of session musicians there that Sam Phillips used, and they played the song, and then he tried a few other things and nothing was particularly working. And at the end of a session, Elvis grabbed a guitar and started playing a song. He started playing That's All Right. Sam Phillips stuck his head round the door and said, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, it's just something that Elvis has started playing." And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of everything.
Well, that's all right, Mama. That's all right for you. That's all right, Mama. Just any way you do it, that's all right.
Elvis's voice, he's on the acoustic guitar, off mic, you can barely hear it. You got Bill Black, bum, 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 thumping along. It's punk rock, 23 years before punk rock happened. All you need is a genius and 3 other talented musicians, and we're going to pop out some absolutely deathless tunes. And that's what they did. It's magic to listen to every time.
Well, Mama, she done told me, Papa done told me too. Son, that gal you fooling with, she ain't no good for you, but that's all right.
That big bass, boom, 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 boom. Well, that's all right, Mama. It was just magnetic,
And when Dewey Phillips started to play That's All Right on the local radio station, the whole world started to think, this is something special.
Sam Phillips had found his perfect performer for the time, and Elvis signed his first deal with Sun Records. Coming up, the King gets a GI trim.
Cool, real cool, around his ears.
But it was was he going to be still cool in 2 years' time?
We were on this fantastic trajectory and now it's all gone.
Aeromoose sponsors evenings on Channel 5.
Golden turkey and gifts from grandchildren make the most magical moments.
Oh, what a load of rubbish.
You know what Christmas moment I like? Every blooming one of them. I love watching the neighbours. Oh, here we go. Zapping the national grid. Oh. I love getting a 12-foot tree in a 10-foot room. I love it. I love surprises. And Christmas clobber.
It looks ridiculous.
And Christmas songs. Even this one. Yes! And Christmas morning.
Christmas!
And I love giving presents. Brenda, got something for you. Forgot Vivian.
All right, Jodie.
All right, Vivian.
And this one's for you.
Thanks, love. What a lovely surprise.
Christmas is full of amazing moments. Christmas is this very moment.
At Tesco, we're already price matching Aldi on hundreds of products. Now we're price matching them on lots of big brands too. Brands like these. And these. And you guessed it, these ones too. So that's lots of big brands now at Aldi prices. Tesco. Every little helps.
We live in CDs you'll never see on screen. Not very pretty, but we sure know how to run things. Living in ruins of a palace within my dreams. And you know, we're on each other's team. We're on each other's
Number 5. Chanel. When was the last time you washed your hands? Go on. We'll wait. In 20 seconds, you can help reduce the spread of infection. We don't care which soap you use. We care that you care. For you and for all. Dove, take care, be safe.
Right. Who's winning the league this season? Will the Blues benefit from German firepower? Can the Blades wrong foot everyone again? Will tactical genius play a part? Maybe the Toffees can continue their great form. Will it be about a Belgian who can put a ball on a sixpence? How are the champions going to cope without him? Whatever happens, it's going to be exciting.
No one knows football better than a Coral Football Better.
Switch it up today to a double quarter pounder with cheese. Double the beef, double the taste. The double quarter pounder with cheese, part of the quarter pounder range.
No camera has ever been on board Britain's nuclear deterrent at sea.
There is no turning back now.
Until now.
Battle stations.
An exclusive look at the country's best-kept secret.
I'm the end of the firing chain. Starts with the Prime Minister, finishes with me.
On board Britain's nuclear submarine, Trident. Wednesday at 9 on Channel 5.
Era Moose sponsors evenings on Channel 5.
Welcome back to Elvis's greatest moments as we explore the life and times of the king of rock and roll.
What Elvis brought was a rawness and a vitality, but what he also brought was the look.
He was absolutely gorgeous. He had this amazing hair and a ducktail that was like floppy and sexy and delicious.
At a time when he came along in the 1950s where acts like Perry Como, it's all very staged, whereas Elvis just came on and he just let his body move to the music.
The egg cracked open and out came the very first rock star.
The newborn rock chick was anything but soft and fluffy, and as the music oozed through him and the crowds became more hysterical, his body seemed barely in control, as vintage archive of his earliest local performances prove, and one early trademark move came more by accident than design.
Legend has it that, of course, the reason Elvis's leg shook so fatally, so historically, was because initially, at least, he was incredibly nervous.
It was a strange piece of success. It infuriated his mother because she could see what he was doing. And, of course, the girls were going frantic.
The local girls went crazy.
Elvis was sex on legs. I mean, if you want to say what's sexy, just put 10 seconds of Elvis performing something. That is sex on legs.
Certainly young people really felt that pull towards him, which is why they then become instantly hysterical. I mean, what looks like medically hysterical.
He must have wondered what the hell was going on, because I don't think he was aware of his own power. I don't really understand what the problem is.
And nearly 20 years later, in the bright, intrusive setting of a New York press conference, a calm and assured Elvis, self-effacingly perhaps, still couldn't see what all the fuss was about.
Man, I was tame compared to what they do now. Are you kidding? I didn't do anything. We just jiggle, you know.
Elvis became to many in America public enemy number one. Everybody said he's thrusting his pelvis, Elvis the pelvis, and this is disgusting and disgraceful.
What he was doing was driving good church-going folk to have saucy thoughts.
I know the evil feeling that you feel when you sing it. I know the lost position that you get into in the beat.
They were literally trying to mitigate against his talent and the thing that he could do the minute he started doing it. You know, boy, was this man dangerous.
When Elvis became too big to ignore by the biggest music TV show in America, a compromise would have to be found. And for his fans, it was all a bit below the belt.
I cringe when I watch the Ed Sullivan Show because You know what's going to happen. Somebody's going to say we're not shooting him from the waist down. He was too damn sexy for American TV.
So you couldn't see his gyrating pelvis, which was a shame. But you know, sometimes when things are left to the imagination, they're a whole lot better.
Behind every superstar is a manager. The man behind the Elvis legend was Colonel Tom Parker, who came to America as an illegal Dutch immigrant and soon learned how to hustle on the US carnival circuit.
Parker was a carnival huckster. His famous act was Parker's Dancing Chickens, where he used to have chickens on a hot plate and gradually turn the heat up. And so that was the level of what he'd done before.
He was a hustler, and he took that fairground hustling into rock and roll management.
When the Colonel became aware of a young rock and roll star signed to Sun Records, he saw a golden opportunity.
Colonel Parker's associate, Tom Diskin, had seen a lot about Elvis Presley in the local press. And he alerted Colonel Parker and said, you really got to go and see this guy. You've got to go and see him. And he saw him several times.
He saw this 19-year-old kid have an effect on audiences that he'd never seen before. Parker's quote was, "You've got $1 million worth of talent, sign with me, you'll have $1 million.
And Colonel Parker acquired Elvis's rights, and of course within a heartbeat, and it really was within a heartbeat, he was signed away from Sun to RCA.
Elvis left Sun Records and the man who signed him, Sam Phillips, behind to embark on a new partnership with the Colonel where everything would be split 50-50.
It's Faustian, really, the pact that Elvis makes with Colonel Tom. Because Colonel Tom comes along and says, I can give you everything, I can give you the world. You just got to do what I say, and you just got to sign here.
Despite criticism of some of the decisions he made for Elvis, a forthright but charismatic Colonel Tom shows a very reasonable and believable front in this intimately shot interview.
Asked me, should I do this or that? It was up to him. He liked it that way. The only song that I was able to have him record, because I thought it was good for him, was Are You Lonesome Tonight? That's the only one.
Elvis, I think, was a country down-home boy that just wanted to get on and sing, and he left the Colonel to do everything. There's a downside to that in that, obviously, he became too powerful, I think.
In 1958, with a string of US #1 singles and 4 hit films under his belt, Elvis's rise seemed unstoppable. But good old Uncle Sam wanted a piece of the king.
When Elvis went into the army, he was doing what anybody of his age group would have to do. That's what they did. National service, he had to do it. And I'm pretty sure he could have got out of it. If he wanted to pull some strings, he could have.
There is something in that makes him just so much more real and appealing, which feeds into what we want to know about Elvis, is that he's one of us. He's clearly not one of us, but he is one of us.
The military top brass viewed enlisting him as something of a coup and wanted the opportunity to try and use the Presley PR machine.
The Air Force, the Navy and the Army all wanted Elvis, and all of them had these ideas about him, going around entertaining the troops. Elvis, to his credit, said, I want no part of that. And he said, I want no special treatment. And to the greatest extent that it was possible for someone like Elvis Presley, he did do that.
They might not have got him performing to the troops, but there was no shortage of press coverage.
The Army doesn't care for those sideboards, the trademark of his fame and fortune as king of rock and roll. Now he's on GI pay and cool, real cool, around his ears.
When it happened, it was a bit of a media circus. Suddenly, Elvis's quiff was being shaved off and he had a GI haircut, but he was still cool. But it was like, was he going to be still cool in 2 years' time? Because in those days, a music career that lasted 18 months in pop music, that was a career.
You would think, oh, that's a disaster, isn't it? Certainly in modern management terms, you would think, well, what about the momentum? What are we going to do? We were on this fantastic trajectory and now it's all gone.
Luckily for Elvis, there was one man who knew how to keep the king current.
Whatever anybody says, about the Colonel, this is where he showed his genius, because he had stockpiled songs throughout the period that Elvis was in the army. He had in America 5 big hit records, even though he wasn't there to promote them. And in doing so, the Colonel made the return an even bigger event than the departure.
One of the more iconic moments in musical history was when the Beatles in 1965 went to meet the King.
By 1965, after 10 years at the top, the King's crown was slipping. No recent big hits and the seemingly endless conveyor belt of films were starting to lose their appeal to even the most ardent fans. And to cap it all, America had been invaded by a bemopped Scouse quartet who were no respecters of legends.
What do you think of Frank Sinatra? Don't know.
Elvis hosting the Beatles was a culturally symbolic moment. And the reason it was symbolic is it was like the passing of a baton.
It's not like Elvis was finished in 1965, far from it, but he was kind of handing over the baton of teeny bop heartthrob-ship to the Beatles.
Suddenly you went, okay, Elvis was the future once. The Beatles are the future now.
The meeting was the idea of Colonel Tom, who had wanted a media circus to witness the handover of power. But the Fab Four had something much more intimate in mind.
The Beatles turn up, no press, just a few hangers-on.
The fact that they were genuinely in awe of him, which is amazing because they, wherever they went, they had a witticism and a funny thing to say, but they were a little bit speechless at being in his presence.
And apparently, there's a moment where the Beatles are all just sitting there looking at Elvis, and Elvis says, "Well, if you guys aren't going to talk, then I'm just going to go on to bed."
Elvis goes and picks up a bass guitar and starts playing, and pretty soon they start jamming.
No footage of this historic meeting exists, but thanks to this docudrama of Elvis's life, with its dodgy set and barely recognisable looky-likey actors, we can see what it would have been like. Probably.
I asked Paul once, what was it like? He said, well, what do you think it was like, Tony? You've met Elvis. You imagine having dinner with him. He said it was just the most remarkable experience for all of us.
Welcome to the Whistle Test Studio for Mickey Newbury.
Little did country singer Mickey Newbury realise, with this unplugged, understated airing of a self-penned song in the hallowed Old Grey Whistle Test studio, he would become the saviour of Elvis's stalling career.
Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland.
Elvis's enthralling, show-stopping reworking of Newbury's lyrics, seen here in all its stonking pomp live from Hawaii, made it an exhilarating highlight of his 70s shows, proving there was no one better at interpreting a song than the King.
Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland.
American Trilogy is a remarkable thing to watch him perform. A performative piece, it's just peerless, really. The whole band, the orchestra, the backing vocalists, they're being conducted by him, as he always did, but it's such a huge, sprawling piece.
Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Its unique combination of 3 traditional songs, Dixie, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and All My Trials, set to an awe-inspiring orchestral backing and with a heart-stopping vocal performance, American Trilogy was the King at his spine-tinglingly live best.
It was a set piece that embraced the Southern legacy of Elvis Presley. It was one of those anthems that Elvis had to include because he had to really tell people where he came from. If there was a way for Elvis to connect to an audience without sort of standing there and telling his life story. It was there.
And as a final blood, sweat and tears salute to his adoring fans, the medley was capped off with this rousingly touching crowd pleaser of an ending. Join us again shortly for a look around the original rock and roll crib.
It was always about Graceland. That was the mothership.
It was a fabulous retreat for him, and it was also his prison.
Welcome back to our celebration of all things Elvis.
For a man who had such great taste in music and picking his own stuff, he didn't really have taste in a lot of other things, because, you know, there's something really ostentatious about Graceland.
In 1957, Elvis bought his dream Memphis home, Graceland.
It was a statement. It was the house on the hill. It was one of the biggest houses in Memphis at that time. It was his temple.
It was always about Graceland. That was the mothership. But also how keen he was to create a sort of a family dwelling. His parents lived there. His bodyguards all lived there. It became a compound.
Graceland was Elvis's main home and the place he loved for 20 years. And after his death in 1977, it's been turned into a museum for fans.
I'm lucky enough I've been there twice. But then you walk in the front door and the first thing you see is the settee. And you think, he sat there.
What surprised me about Graceland, I had been looking forward to going for so many years. I felt almost shy of walking across the threshold. One of the first rooms you come to, you walk through the hall, the first thing you see is his parents' bedroom, the room where Gladys and Vernon lived. And then, of course, you get to the jungle room.
The jungle room has become synonymous with the gaudy excess of Graceland, as Joanna Lumley discovered in this insightful 2015 tour of the mansion with Priscilla Presley, who recalls the domesticity of her life with great affection and immediacy.
It was a furniture store, and it had the ugliest furniture I've ever seen in that window. So Elvis wanted to know where it was, and he told him. He went down there, saw it, and took it all out of the window, bought it that day, and had it all delivered. And that was how Elvis did things.
But what was once a happy family home, in later years became more like a jail for the king.
Graceland had become a mausoleum to Elvis years before he died. He was caged up there, unable to go out. He would have loved to have gone out, I think, just for a walk in his hometown. He couldn't do that, and I think that got to him. Graceland was a fabulous retreat for him, and it was also his prison.
It's so tied in with the mythology of Elvis and who he was and what he was. And Graceland's almost become the symbol of him now more than anything.
Elvis Presley met Priscilla when he was overseas in the national services. She was a beautiful girl, and there was an instant chemistry, and it became one of the love affairs of the century.
Priscilla Beaulieu was in Germany with her mother and stepfather, also in the military. She first met Elvis at a party at just 14. In this intimate documentary featuring grainy but fascinating home movies of the king, Priscilla opens up, as if recalling meeting him just yesterday, revealing the instant rapport they clearly had.
You know, Elvis was sitting in a chair, and he was breathtaking. I mean, he was truly, you know, much more handsome in life than even on the screen, which is hard to believe. And I was introduced to him, and he got up, and he said, well, what do we have here? You know?
I think when he met Priscilla, he fell absolutely head over heels in love with her. They were genuinely a really passionate, loving couple.
Under the watchful eye of her parents, the couple became close. But just 6 months after they first met, it was time for Elvis to return to the US.
Elvis Presley, with girlfriend Priscilla Beaulieu to see him off, was leaving Frankfurt at the end of his army service.
He anointed her as his chosen one, and then just was able to bide his time because he was Elvis and she wasn't ever going to go anywhere else.
Amazingly, the relationship endured. and eventually Priscilla joined Elvis at Graceland.
Elvis always thought it was very important to settle down and have a family. That was one of his innate values, and that was something that he felt his mother would have wanted him to do. So in meeting Priscilla, that really was a lightning moment, I think, for Elvis.
On May the 1st, 1967, they were married in Las Vegas, and just a year later, their only child, Lisa Marie, was born.
If you see the early videos of them together, Priscilla and Elvis, that's a love story. They're young Americans doing rather well in life, being in love and having a kid, and setting out on life's rocky highway. Unfortunately, it did get a bit rocky for them.
I think if you marry somebody like Elvis, you know, a star of that magnitude, how on earth are you going to make a marriage work ultimately? Because he's worked so hard by the Colonel. And I think Priscilla felt neglected. And then, of course, often when he was at home, he'd have the guys around him.
Elvis had the family he had always yearned for. But for Priscilla, the dream was turning sour.
I think it's a testament to the great bonds they had, that they did get married, they did have a child, and that they stayed very, very close throughout the remainder of his life. So something clearly very special was found in those incredibly unlikely surroundings in Germany all that time ago.
For Elvis, armed with a new record deal and a new manager, the next stage in world domination was the fastest growing form of entertainment in 50s America, television.
These TV shows on the whole weren't recorded because they didn't have that kind of system in those days. You know, Elvis was pointed at a camera and he did what he had to do.
Now a key moment in 20th century cultural history, the King's celebrated performance on the Milton Berle Show gave US audiences their first glimpse of a raring-to-go, cool-as-flip Elvis and his killer moves.
You ain't nothing but
The performance led to a huge backlash, as Milton Berle forcefully recalled with great clarity many years later, in a frank interview, revealing he was very much on the side of the King, despite so many outraged complaints.
10 days later, I got about 400,000 pan letters. Not fan letters, pan letters, and blaming me. We'll never watch you again, Uncle Milty, when you put that vulgar man that jives and wiggles his backside in his butt. It's disgusting.
He called up the Colonel and said, you know what, you have got a star on your hands. Because what it did was it launched him out there. It made him a controversial figure. It made Elvis and his pelvis the topic of conversation everywhere.
The uproar had made Elvis hot property, and he was offered a spot on another huge show, hosted by Steve Allen. But this time, they were prepared.
They have to take the threat out of the punk, really, and make him applicable to everyone.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, good crying all the time.
This frankly ridiculous performance to an actual hound dog still couldn't stymie the King's showmanship, which was on full display.
You ain't no friend of mine, you ain't nothing but a...
Even when they dressed him up in a tuxedo to try and sort of, you know, smarten him up and have him sing to a hound dog, there's still some humour there. There's still a cheekiness. There's still a raw energy under the surface that's waiting just to burst out. And that wasn't contrived. You know, that wasn't Elvis saying, I know what I'm going to do. When I become a pop star, I'm going to be really controversial. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. It was just him being him.
It was now time for the host of the biggest show of all to come calling. Ed Sullivan had earlier refused to have Elvis on his show, but as he was now the biggest star in the country, he had no choice.
Ed Sullivan had been very vocal about Elvis Presley being profane. Basically, Ed Sullivan had to eat something a little less tasty than humble pie because Elvis Presley was fast becoming the biggest thing. So we had to bring Elvis on the show.
Then when Ed Sullivan did have him on the show, he was on with the Jordanaires and he did Love Me Tender.
Love me.
This cleverly restrained and hypnotic performance, and the new Dreamboat Elvis persona, went a long way to pacifying many of his detractors, but the girls were still screaming.
Made my life, please. and I love you so.
They used television to market the new, beautiful, unthreatening Elvis with this gorgeous ballad.
Beneath the showbiz exterior, Elvis was a straightforward Southern boy, and throughout his life there was one person who mattered more to him than anyone else: his mother, Gladys. But just a few months into his army career, he received the devastating news that she had fallen ill. He returned home to be by her side, but she died on the 14th of August 1958, aged just 46.
To lose her when he was so young must have been tremendously hard because it was a real anchor point for him.
That must have been completely devastating for the king, losing his mum like that.
But Elvis, this makes you want to cry. He just said, I only ever did this for my mum. You know, he wanted to please her and he wanted to make her life comfortable.
There was that real kind of symbiosis, perhaps because he was one of twins and the only one that survived, so that would have made him all the more precious to her. In a way, she'd have been happier if he hadn't been successful and he'd been sitting, doing a normal job and she'd seen him every day.
The heartbreak of losing her son to fame had been hard for Gladys for many years, and a reliance on prescription drugs and alcohol had taken its toll.
I think her mental attitude couldn't take the fact that she'd lost her son before she'd actually lost her son. And of course she did die of liver failure through alcoholic poisoning.
Dying so prematurely at the age of 46, that was, it wasn't brought on by Elvis, but in a way, his fame did that to her.
Ah, Christmas, a time of turkeys, presents and family arguments. And since 1957, there's only been one soundtrack to the Yuletide fun.
When Elvis did a Christmas album, you don't go, oh, Christmas album? Oh, is there no stone unturned with this management? What you do is you go, Elvis has made a Christmas album. Actually, I like that.
The Elvis Presley Christmas album hurled itself out of the shops. It's still the biggest selling Christmas album of all time in America.
Every house must have had at least 2 copies.
Elvis was a huge fan of the holidays, and these intimate Super 8 home movies, poignantly and nostalgically flickering, allow us a privileged look into Elvis's Christmas past.
These were songs that he would sing in Gracelands when they were having their Christmas holiday. He'd sing those. That comes over in the album. That there's a guy here really singing and enjoying the songs that he sings.
Blue Christmas is one of the great Christmas songs. There's no two ways about it.
I'll have a blue Christmas.
This rendition of Blue Christmas still resonated with fans more than 10 years later, as a leathered-up Elvis gave a focused, pared-down performance on his '68 comeback special. But the Christmas album was a disc of 2 halves. Side 2 was dedicated to Elvis's gospel roots.
Elvis was very deeply spiritual. He grew up going to gospel church down in Tupelo, Mississippi. He was a deep believer. Elvis always carried that through his life and first appeared really in his career on that album.
There will be peace in the valley for me.
Despite the grainy black and white footage, Elvis's spiritual conviction on The Ed Sullivan Show is unmistakable and demonstrates his versatility and already broad appeal.
After Peace in the Valley came out, it showed if you will, the Christian side, the religious side of Elvis Presley. And that really embraced Elvis to all sections of the community.
After his meteoric rise to be the king of rock and roll, Elvis had already set his sights on another passion.
He wanted to be a movie star.
He's got a bit of Brando about him. He's got a bit of James Dean about him. But Brando and James Dean that can sing.
Producers knew, they saw the fame that he had and the success that he had as a pop star, and of course would think, let's get him in movies.
Elvis wanted it, the producers wanted it, but as ever, Colonel Parker was all over it.
Colonel Parker's influence came to the fore once again, cashing in on the Elvis phenomenon as Hollywood came inevitably knocking at the door.
He auditioned and did the screen test for a film called The Rainmaker, which was Burt Lancaster and Katharine Hepburn. Parker realised there was no way he could sell this as an Elvis vehicle over Lancaster and Hepburn. He was told he couldn't do it. So instead, he got Love Me Tender.
Love Me Tender was a Civil War era western. Elvis didn't even have top billing, but his restrained and compelling performance as farmhand Clint Reno saw the king comfortably holding his own alongside established stars such as Richard Egan.
You ain't your old self tonight. Oh, I'm all right. A little tired, I reckon. Vance, I know you and Kathy used to be kind of fond of each other, but well, you ain't got no hard feelings against either one of us now, have you?
Clint, the character that Elvis plays, is very wet behind the ears and a bit nervous and juvenile. And then he gets on stage and he becomes sex god Elvis Presley. And you're like, well, how did that happen?
I dance with the girl I love, my head goes round and round. When she is close to me, I can't stay on the ground.
Despite playing against his on-screen character, scenes like this are a knowing reference to Elvis's formative country fair appearances, and the clever Colonel had ensured that 4 songs be included in the film.
It didn't even really matter that Elvis seems to have a brill-creamed quiff in it that certainly doesn't seem very Civil War America. It was Elvis. That's the main thing. They had him in their movie, and that's why people would go and see it.
And the biggest song of all was the title number.
Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go.
It's so dainty, it's so gentle. It's as if he's just sitting next to you and just imparting some beautiful love poem to you.
For my darling, I love you, and I always will.
I think you got a lot of people excited. A lot of teenagers just, wow, you know, this is an intimate moment.
It was video jukeboxes, every one of them were. And of course, that worked for a global audience, big time.
The King's debut acting role was such a success, it opened the door for a staggering 31 Elvis films in total, only ending in 1968. Coming up, Elvis meets Tricky Dicky.
He went in there, he wanted to be part of the FBI.
It's a very bizarre chapter in American history, I have to say.
Welcome back to the greatest moments in the life and times of Elvis Presley.
The most publicized soldier since Napoleon was leaving Frankfurt at the end of his army service. At Fort Dix, New Jersey, newsreels, TV, the press, the lot told the world how Elvis came marching home.
But between leaving Germany and landing back in the US, Elvis laid foot on British soil for the first time. Sadly, it was to be the only reported time, as he never toured outside of North America.
People used to say, why didn't Elvis come to Britain? Elvis didn't like flying, was one theory. He didn't like flying. He bought an aeroplane and called it after his daughter, you know, Lisa Marie. He wasn't afraid of flying.
Legend has it there was one big reason he never left home: Colonel Tom Parker.
Well, the story goes that Colonel Tom Parker was an illegal immigrant. He was Dutch. And basically the theory goes that he got into a fight with somebody and he accidentally killed someone in a fight. And as a result, he panicked and he fled the country and he went to the United States. Because of that reality, he always had it in the back of his mind that they might still be looking for him, or he might cross the border and suddenly he gets arrested.
The Colonel didn't want to leave the States. He really didn't. It wasn't because he was a legal immigrant and that he wouldn't get back into the States. I mean, he knew 6 presidents, for heaven's sake. You know, you don't get close to a president without the CIA, the FBI and every man and his dog checking you out beforehand. You know, there was nothing scurrilous about Colonel Parker's background.
He didn't want to let Elvis go without him because he wanted, you know, he had to be in control of everything that was going on.
But on the 3rd of March 1960, during a refueling stop on his return home, Elvis landed at Prestwick Airport in Scotland.
When he touched down in Scotland on the way home, thousands of young Scottish girls came to see him at the airport, and he moved among them easily, you know, hugging them, chatting them, kissing them.
Fans were able to sort of touch him and talk to him through the wire fence. That's an amazing moment. You know, these kids from Scotland are getting to see Elvis Presley where nobody else had done.
And when you saw Elvis moving among the fans in Scotland, you realised that's what Tom Parker never let him do.
He may have felt relaxed amongst his fans, but he still wasn't sure where the adoring crowds were from.
I love this idea of Elvis landing in Scotland and saying, "Where am I?" I wonder how the Scots feel about that.
From the earliest days of his career, Elvis had an entourage of associates and bodyguards, many of them friends he'd grown up with.
Elvis was a polite, generous, family-loving man who looked after his team that was around him. He had the same team around him for his whole life.
Elvis created this cocoon around himself, and who can blame him? He was in a goldfish bowl, for God's sake.
As his fame grew, so did the prominence of the people around him, and they even got their own name, the Memphis Mafia.
He needed the Memphis Mafia to protect him from everything else that could happen outside of that bubble.
Elvis was feeding them all, clothing them all, and giving a lot of his wealth to them all, cars and jewellery and everything else. But of course they took advantage of that.
In his later years, weight ballooning and rumours of drug addiction rife, the only people to have regular contact with Elvis were his family, the Colonel, and the Memphis Mafia.
At Graceland, where he was holed up, a recluse from the rest of the world, well, there was this huge entourage by now, taking his money, you know. Yes, Elvis, great Elvis, have another sandwich, Elvis.
Elvis needed someone to turn around and say, Elvis, look, you know, this isn't working, mate. Let's do something different. It's easy for me to say. I couldn't have said it.
From the no-nonsense title sequence and innocent pictures of the childhood they shared with Elvis, this no-holds-barred 1997 documentary forcefully shows emotions as still raw for key members of his entourage, as they vividly recall the difficulties of living with a man on the edge.
Shake him and say, God, man, get a grip now. You've got it all going for you. Why throw it in the damn trash can?
He needed us there, and we were there. And if any of you think that we didn't try to stop him from taking these medications, you're full of it. You're full of it. Because we love this guy, and we saw what he was doing to himself.
A bigger problem by then was this rapacious tabloid press over there, the National Enquirer, the Star, the Globe. These garish stories were coming out of Graceland, and that reached its zenith when 3 members of his entourage were sensationally suddenly sacked.
On the 13th of July, 1976, Elvis's father, Vernon, fired Red and Sonny West. They had worked for the King for 20 years and were given just 1 week's severance pay. Feeling aggrieved, they decided to write a tell-all book exposing what was really going on at Graceland.
They told the story of the way Elvis was living. It was almost probably literally a suicidal way of living. He was literally slowly killing himself, and you wonder if he didn't know that by then.
Sonny and Red were accused of cashing in on the King, but this press conference from the time not only shows what a huge story this was, but also how very raw emotions still were, his former friends barely able to contain their anger.
I wrote this book. It was out of bitterness and hurt to start with. I tell you, when we were given 3 days' notice by his father and a week's pay, after 16 years, 20 years, 2.5, 3 years with Dave, we all had families, and he wouldn't talk to us himself. He flew out of town, and he had his father do it. Maybe it will do some good for him, for the drug culture, for people to realize no one is out of reach of drugs, man. Here is a man that had it in the palm of his hand and started off with it that way, and the drugs took it away from him.
Sadly, Sonny's hopes of helping his former employee overcome his problems were dashed when Elvis died shortly after the book was published.
I'm convinced Red, West and Sonny, they will have gone to their graves knowing that that book helped accelerate Elvis's death.
After his early rock and roll success, by the mid-1960s, seemingly more interested in his never-ending stream of film vehicles and facing stiff competition from the new wave of pop bands, the King was in danger of becoming yesterday's man.
Now, in that period, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, Elvis didn't have a top 10 except for one record, which was #1 in the UK, and it was called Crying in the Chapel. And it was a gospel record. And it sounded like he meant it.
I'm happy in the chapel.
This is a sincere and clear-voiced Elvis committing his faithful prayer to vinyl, his voice as smooth and essential as ever.
Yes, we gather in the chapel just to sing and praise the Lord.
And that's what made Elvis Presley a great singer, because there was something within him that meant that whatever he sang, when he sang it, it was believable.
Crying in the Chapel came from the 1967 album How Great Thou Art, which was a return to his gospel roots.
It's at the base of his talent. That voice is steeped in that tradition, I think. So he was bound to do something with it, which he did in 67. He released his gospel album. And it's done in complete sincerity.
My soul, my Savior, I got to thee. Oh, how great, oh, thank you, Lord.
The album's title song, How Great Thou Art, finally saw the King recognised by the Grammys, winning the Best Sacred Performance category in 1967. And in this 1977 rendition, recorded just weeks before he died. Despite being grossly overweight, his energy and passion are clear to see.
For him to record a gospel album and it to be recognised, win a Grammy, it was a worldwide or iconic album, very much like on the scale of Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace.
As well as recognition by the Grammys, the church-going American public lapped it up.
If you convince people who go to church every week this is a genuine attempt to praise God, you will sell millions of albums. And I don't think he did it for that reason. But it was a side issue. It was what happened.
Elvis sang for people. He sang on people's behalf.
It's his passion, and that comes across on the record really beautifully, I think.
By 1970, Elvis was becoming the elder statesman of rock and roll, and he was starting to despair of the youth of today.
Elvis was very prude in some ways and very, very conservative. You know, he was brought up in that Southern way.
He was never a counterculture man, and in fact became very conservative, very patriotic, pro-guns, anti-drugs. You know, that was Elvis.
He was worried about the hippies, and he was worried about the drug culture, and he was worried about the racial inequality.
With so many of society's ills to fix, there was only one person he felt could help.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office
of President of the United States.
But how do you get to meet with the president? Well, just write him a letter, drop it off at the White House, and wait.
He wanted to talk to President Nixon, so he just turned up there and demanded it.
Nixon allowed him to have a meeting in the White House, but by all accounts, Nixon was quite nervous about meeting Elvis Presley.
And when he got there, he was wearing the most outrageous outfit. He was wearing a white collar shirt with massive collars and what looked like almost like a black cape. And then his hair was all floppy, and he was wearing these gold glasses. He was wearing his rings and all his stuff and all his Elvis stuff. And then Elvis demanded a badge.
And this was no ordinary badge. He wanted a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, which would make the King a federal agent at large.
He went in there. He wanted to be part of the FBI, team to kill drug taking.
Which is wholly ironic, because by then Elvis was addicted to prescription drugs.
There you go. That was a bit weird, trying to stamp out drug taking.
The bizarre meeting was captured in this timeless photograph, which until recently was the most requested image at the US National Archives.
It's a very bizarre chapter in American history, I have to say.
After leaving the army, Elvis made the hit film G.I. Blues, but its mix of light comedy and pop songs had left him hankering for more challenging acting roles.
He got Flaming Star, written for Brando, but it's not very good. So he then does Wild in the Country, another black and white movie, very little music, serious subject matter, but again, it's dull, it's boring. So they decide, right, we've given you your chance, you've done these two. Let's give you Blue Hawaii.
Blue Hawaii was a return to the safe comedic formula of G.I. Blues, feel-good comedy interspersed with catchy tunes. And however much he longed to be a serious actor, Elvis's slick performances of songs like Rock-a-Hula Baby were exactly what the public wanted.
A-hula baby rock, a-hula baby got a hula from a Honolulu, there's a rock-a-hula baby of mine.
Blue Hawaii's a holiday on film. It's like it's Mamma Mia. It's just that you're just escaping for a while and just watching pretty people do silly stuff. It's very glamorous, very easy to watch, but mainly it's Angela Lansbury who gives a hell of a performance as Sarah Lee. She plays Elvis's mum in it.
Mom, it's time I started doing something for myself, like making my own decisions.
Chadwick! Chadwick! Your mother hasn't finished and you haven't had your dinner.
All of a sudden, I'm not hungry.
Angela Lansbury may have breezily played his domineering Southern Belle Mama in charmingly disposable scenes like these, but she was just 10 years older than Elvis at the time.
That's the power of Angela Lansbury as an actor, that you can be convinced that she's old enough to play Elvis's mum when clearly she isn't. But she gives a really fierce and forceful performance. I love the chemistry between those two.
The film had an incredible 14 songs crammed into just under 97 minutes, including this unforgettable classic.
Wise men say only fools.
Even the slightly hammy premise of the scene can't diminish the King's smouldering performance.
But I can't help falling in love with you.
14 songs, more than double the last two films between them, and it does box office gold.
Putting the music in made sense financially, and Colonel Tom was always thinking financially, and he knew that he could make more money from the spin-off EPs and soundtracks and copyrights and all those kind of things that come with music if the music is in the film. I think the soundtrack album was #1 for 20 weeks in the States. Ridiculous.
Blue Hawaii is a double-edged sword because it was enormously successful and it's a great fun movie. But because it was enormously successful and a great fun movie, it became the template for every other Elvis film.
Over the next 8 years, Elvis made another 23 films, all following the same golden formula.
It made sense for Colonel Tom to say, you should do this. From a business perspective, he was getting paid $1 million a movie. He was getting paid a huge chunk of the box office per movie. Elvis is thinking, I used to be a rebellious, cutting-edge rock and roller. I used to be a bad boy. What's happened?
Join us in a bit for The King versus Old Blue Eyes.
Elvis is more relevant. Elvis has got the power and the potency that Frank had maybe 10 years before.
Goodbye, Frank.
These are Elvis's greatest moments. The King is very much still in the building. After a courtship lasting nearly 8 years, Priscilla Beaulieu and Elvis Presley had married in Las Vegas. But when they returned home to Memphis, the young bride soon discovered the huge pressures of being married to the biggest star in the world.
If Gracelands became a prison for Elvis, it was Fort Knox for Priscilla. Poor girl could never get out. She was stuck there all the time while Elvis was going off, doing concerts, making records. also, Elvis wasn't a saint. This is a very attractive, very rich young man to whom women were attracted to like a magnet, you know, and he didn't always resist them. And I think Priscilla knew about that, and that was a very corrosive thing for their relationship.
The months apart meant the couple started leading separate lives. Priscilla was still in her early 20s, and the pain and regret is movingly evident in her memories of the time, clearly born out of genuine love for Elvis.
While Elvis was out of town, or while he was working on a movie, I started finding things to do. I mean, I had now my friends, which was separate from his. It was just we needed to sit down and talk. And I'm sure anything could have been resolved, but those times weren't really there.
It's sad that it broke down because I think he always thought, in an old-fashioned sense, that Priscilla would hang around. She'd be there, even if he was off philandering, doing whatever he was doing. But she ended up going off with a guy called Mike Stone, who was a karate instructor that Elvis was friends with.
Despite his own indiscretions, Elvis felt betrayed. 20 years after his death, in a gonzo-style warts-and-all documentary, his friends recall his shocking reaction. In their visceral recollections, it's obvious how much they loved and protected him, even in great adversity.
Priscilla started taking lessons from Mike Stone in L.A.
Karate lessons. Elvis jumped up, went in and got this assault rifle. I think it was AK-47 or something. And he came out, or either Thompson machine guns, one of the two, and he came out and put it in my hand. Said, Sonny, go kill Mike Stone. Do it for me. Go kill him. I said, no. He had lost her, and he knew it.
She felt neglected, and I think she was neglected. And I think the only reason, or one of the reasons that she had an affair with with Elvis's karate teacher was because he was there and he was nice to her.
By the summer of 1972, Priscilla had had enough. She left Graceland with their daughter, Lisa Marie, and started divorce proceedings.
But once she was gone, I think that's when he really realised what he was missing with her. And I think he also felt slightly ashamed as well that his marriage had broken down. There was a stable influence in Elvis's life that was gone.
He always called Priscilla the love of his life, and it went on a horrible rocky road. They went their separate ways, and her departure from his life, I think, was the beginning of the end.
The divorce was finalised on October the 9th, 1973. There was a settlement of $1.5 million. But the couple showed no signs of hard feelings, even holding hands to sign the legal papers.
It was always very poignant watching the pictures of them divorcing. The idea that two people so famous, so much water under the bridge, and then they left the divorce court hand in hand. And I find that picture very poignant, knowing that pretty much that was probably one of the last happy days of his life.
When Elvis was demobbed in 1960, his screaming fans couldn't wait for the bad boy of rock and roll to get back into the studio.
You'd think that he would come straight out with something really up-tempo and it would be right in your face and it would be pure rock and roll. But he doesn't. He goes for Are You Lonesome Tonight?
Are you lonesome tonight? Do you miss me tonight? Are you sorry we drifted apart?
In fact, some of my favourite recordings Elvis ever did, and actually shows everybody just how beautiful Elvis's voice was.
Here he was, a bare-naked singer, giving it out.
It wasn't just raucous and raw, or it wasn't just a little dainty and quiet when he needed to do a ballad. It was lyrical, you know. It had a beautiful timbre and quality that he hadn't really expressed before that point.
The song was a huge hit and became a much-loved staple of his sets. 8 years after its release, in the up-close and personal Unplugged section of his comeback special, the song sounds as fresh and as sumptuous as ever.
Straight to a bright summer day when I kissed you and called you sweetheart.
I think this is the point at which his career is really trying to grab a breadth of audience, so it's not just about young people.
It was almost as though a decision had been taken somewhere and had been imposed on him that he was now a mature performer.
The person behind the hit was Colonel Tom, for the first and only time helping Elvis choose a song. A favourite of the Colonel's wife, The original version was a 1920s music hall number, here recorded with suitably exaggerated enunciation by Charles Hart.
Tonight, do you miss me tonight? Are you sorry we drifted apart?
But in true Elvis style, he seamlessly made the song his own, even making an unforgettable Hank is at the ready monologue his own for good measure.
You're lonesome tonight. You know, someone said that the world's a stage and each must play a part.
The most interesting thing about that song is the talking part in the middle. For me, that imparts a lot of personality into that song. That's really the bit that tells the story. And that's, I think, what Elvis liked about the song. And that's partly why it was such a significant song, because it was different.
In this, one of his last concert performances, the words almost tragically escaped him.
I never missed a cue. They came back too. You forgot the words. Seemed to change, you fool.
But to the great joy of the adoring audience, he famously turned what could have been an embarrassing gaffe into yet another unforgettable Elvis moment.
And I'm standing there without any hair. No. And you won't come back to me. What the heck with it?
In 1969, off the back of his comeback special, Elvis recorded the From Memphis album, once again reinventing his sound.
That Memphis album was a real quantum leap and a message to the world that forget the bad movies now, this is me now, I'm going somewhere else now.
One of the album's most surprising songs was In the Ghetto, performed here with uncharacteristic melancholy and subtlety as part of his Vegas show in 1970. Still lean and mean, this was Elvis, but not as we'd heard him before.
And a poor little baby child is born in the ghetto. And his mama cries.
In the Ghettos, it's a subject matter that you wouldn't even imagine that Elvis would touch. He certainly wouldn't have touched it on any of his movie soundtracks. You know, on a cold and grey December morning, a little baby child is born in the ghetto and his mama cries. And it's like, these are songs with some kind of social relevance. There's social comment.
The way he did it was so pure. You know, it's not aggressive. It doesn't feel overtly political. It's just saying how tragic this is. You know, and that's the sadness that comes through in the song. And again, because Elvis was so brilliant at emoting that, it has such a powerful effect.
And a hungry little boy with the runny nose plays in the street as a cold wind blows in the ghetto. And his hunger burns.
And you believe him. And the reason you believe him is because that kind of authenticity and sincerity that made him the catalyst, the spark, the revolution that was rock and roll in the first place, that was him. That was inherent in him. That wasn't an act. He still had that.
But there was one track that came to define the King at this time, and for many, it is the ultimate Elvis song.
Suspicious Minds is the single biggest song that any Elvis tribute artist does. If you can only do one song, if you're booked to do an appearance where you're doing one song, you do Suspicious Minds.
Okay.
In 1973's Aloha from Hawaii special, the King is oozing with style, about to embark on another era-defining performance.
I can't walk around because I love you too much, baby.
It encapsulates everything about Elvis. It's balletic, but it's also fast and energetic, and it's a hugely physical number as well, with all the moves that you do, all the karate he used to do, and the way he developed that song for his live performances. It has become symbolic of everything that is Elvis. There's excess, there's excitement, there's moving lyrics, there's feeling, it's just a bit of everything. There's bombast, there's everything you can imagine. It is just like throwing the kitchen sink at the audience, that song.
Elvis's third film outing in 1957 was to be his most iconic and truly cemented his bad boy image of the time.
There was outrage about Jailhouse Rock because of the language, because he was an ex-con, and he wasn't wrongfully imprisoned in the movie. Vince did what he did. Manslaughter. He killed someone.
Vince, he's had enough.
Playing moody construction worker Vince Everett, Elvis channels his inner James Dean.
Hey, kid, you can hit.
The smouldering good looks and bad boy persona may have caused outrage amongst the adults, but adoring teens lapped it up.
Why would you want to see your idol behaving themselves and being all clean cut and nice? You wanted to see them being a bit of a bad boy, and he's not a nice character in that film.
But the King wasn't any ordinary lag. He was a lag that could sing, and thanks to the Lieber and Stoller soundtrack, it produced one of his biggest hits.
This is Lieber and Stoller at their very best. Jailhouse Rock is a brilliant song. It's a brilliantly written song. And this is where Elvis doesn't use any of that kind of very low range of his voice. He doesn't do any of that in this song. It's all right up there, right on the edge.
Walking through a party in the county jail. The prison band was there, they began to wail. The band was jumping and the joint began to swing. You should have heard the knocked out jail.
With its unmistakable backdrop and iconic dance routine, which Elvis choreographed himself, this performance is widely acknowledged as the prototype for the modern music promo.
That dance routine for the Jailhouse Rock scene, which in the movie is being filmed for a TV show, it's just him freestyling. There is serious hip wiggling in that scene that is very different to, let's say, the Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly kind of highly choreographed musicals that really were of the same era.
Come on and do the jailhouse rock with me, let it rock. Go, go, go! Everybody let it rock. Lay it on me, daddy-o! Everybody
That Jailhouse Rock sequence was him having control. And I think that's why it's iconic and that's why it works, because it's him being Elvis. And that's the nearest we ever get to seeing Elvis on screen.
When Elvis came home from Germany in 1960, Colonel Tom wasted no time in getting his star back where he belonged.
What he arranges is for Elvis to go on Frank Sinatra's show. Sinatra obviously didn't think much of the music of Elvis Presley, but knew from a business perspective that he had to get on board with this. There'd obviously been some high-level talks among managers about, you gotta do this, kid, I don't care, you gotta do it. This kid's big.
Now, folks, what would you say if I were going to sing another song now?
In fact, old Blue Eyes went a step further and put on this Welcome Home TV special. Despite the time-worn old footage, it's clear to see a slightly reticent Sinatra, almost uncomfortable at the prospect of sharing his stage with a confident young usurper.
The old school and the new school meet together on television. Sinatra and Elvis. You thought in your heart Elvis wasn't going to come out of this very well at all.
From the off, the old master struggles to cope with the sheer intoxicating stage presence of his bête noire, delivering a crooningly awkward and unremarkable version of Love Me Tender to boot.
Never let me go. You have made my life complete, and I love you so.
Well, Sinatra sang Love Me Tender. Okay. You pass your audition, but you're not going to get the crown, mate. Then Elvis did Witchcraft.
Looking every inch the master, Elvis effortlessly upstages the elder statesman.
My conscience bears through witchcraft.
We cut to Elvis and he goes, those fingers through my hair. And he's just playing with it. He's acting like this is a bit silly. You know, he's got a silly grin on his face.
Such an ancient pitch. Switch. 'Cause there's no nicer witch than witchcraft.
He's just doing a bit of fun impression and suddenly the girls will scream when he does that. You know, it makes Frank look pretty old, to be honest.
Elvis is more relevant. Elvis has got the power and the potency that Frank had maybe 10 years before. And we'd see it happen to Elvis, not too much further down the line, of course. But at that point, he was the man.
He'd had a damn good run at Sinatra. Now it's time for Elvis. So thank you very much. Goodbye, Frank.
Coming up, Elvis's last time in front of the camera.
Everybody said, what did he say? He's standing on my foot. And that's what made Elvis laugh.
Welcome back to our countdown of the King's greatest moments.
I remember one day in a little house in Oldham, my mate George Briley had a Dan Setti record player. I remember it to this day. I close my eyes, I hear certain Elvis tracks, and I'm back in George Briley's living room listening to Elvis's records.
In 1957, British teenagers finally woke up to the King, and it was this song with its immortal lyrics that got them all shook up.
I'm in love. I'm all shook up. Yeah.
It's a funny tempo at All Shook Up. It's kind of gentle but not gentle. You know, it's got energy but in a very laid back way, which I think is very fun about All Shook Up. And I have to say, whenever I perform, All Shook Up is always a song people request. They always want to hear it. So for whatever reason, that song really resonated here.
It was a cultural shock to us, big time. And to hear that music entwined with production, the like of which we'd never experienced before, it was fabulous.
My hands are shaky and my knees are weak. I can't seem to stand on my own feet. Who do you think when you have such luck? I'm all shook up.
This peerless back-to-basics performance on his '68 special showed an Elvis unmistakable to millions. But back in 1950s Britain, the King was still a mystery.
We hadn't seen Milton Berle, Dorsey Brothers, Ed Sullivan Show. No one outside of America had.
Elvis was the first pop or music or rock star that I actually had a crush on. And there was no television. I never saw him on TV, but I heard his voice and I saw his photographs.
And just like their teenage cousins across the pond, UK kids grabbed their chance.
There was a point before teenagers. It's hard to kind of explain it. There were no teenagers. You were a kid and then you got a job. And they were the two bits of your life. There was no in-between. And this in-between bit was the bit where all the magic was. And it was unstoppable.
All Shook Up was to be the first of his 21 UK top spots, even more than a young group of lads from Liverpool who in the late 50s were also teens captivated by the King.
You know, the teenager, suddenly they had something of their own. They could be independent thinkers. It's irresistible because not only does it turn you into a fan with your own genius and your own love for music, but it turns you into an activist, a creator. And it's interesting that the first set of people to respond to it do become the Beatles, do become the Rolling Stones.
By 1968, everything had changed, except Elvis. He'd stopped touring, he'd stopped performing. The only way you could see Elvis Presley was on a movie, and people weren't watching his movies anymore.
Concerned about his diminishing returns, Tom Parker approached the US TV stations to try and reboot the King's career. But the Colonel's ideas were also very 1950s.
The idea of the TV special was really actually just to take a bunch of songs from his movies, some of the better songs, and just do some new stagings of them. Colonel Parker, by the way, wanted Elvis to finish the special dressed as Father Christmas, singing a Christmas song at the end.
Luckily, the producers and Elvis managed to dissuade the Colonel from making a Yuletide log of proceedings, but many set-piece numbers were recorded, including this now iconic, much-copied opening with an incomparably cool rendition of Guitar Man. The King's return was already looking impressive, but the best was yet to come.
The person you have to thank most for the comeback special, apart from Elvis himself, is Steve Binder, who was the director. He saw Elvis playing around with his friends in the dressing room, just playing some songs and just being Elvis, just enjoying his music as he always did. And he said, we've got to get that on camera. We've got to do something with that.
Here, a refreshingly relaxed Elvis, expressing himself without inhibition, performs Lordy Miss Claudie. This intimate, stripped-back, unplugged setting was at the core of the now legendary '68 comeback special.
I'm
That's the first thing that hits you. The King is right in the middle of the audience. I mean, really close. And you can see the adoration from the girls near to him.
He crystallised the fact that he could communicate with an audience who were only feet away from him, that he could embrace that audience, that could captivate that audience. And it was filmed so you felt you were there in that audience.
Goodbye, Tony, darling. Down the road I go. Can't stop me now, man. Can't stop me. I said bye. Bye-bye, baby. Gal, I won't be coming no more. Goodbye, Tony, darling. Down the road I go.
It reminded people of who he was, the performer he was, the singer he was, the absolutely magnetic, charismatic force of nature that he was.
After the huge success of the comeback special, there was only one place left for Elvis to go: Vegas.
He was very nervous about his return to Las Vegas in the summer of 1969 because he had done a stint in Vegas briefly early in his career that had been a complete flop, because the type of audiences they had in Vegas back then were just the total opposite of what he needed for his show. So he was really nervous about going back to Vegas.
Further ramping up the pressure, MGM made this fly-on-the-wall film of his 1970 gig at the Vegas International Hotel, candidly capturing the great and the good of Hollywood royalty at the court of the king. But what's fascinating is the nervous focus, showing how seriously Elvis took his profession.
Can't believe it. I hope I don't forget the words, man. You won't. I just can't believe it. She's lying just beside me, and my heart beats with the rhythm of her song. The only one right there, that first verse. You got the rest of it. I'll get through the first one. I get it. Right. Get it made, man.
The pre-gig nerves were unfounded, as, just like his triumphant '68 comeback, he effortlessly knocked it out the park. The documentary artfully intercuts between his hysterical fans and a barnstorming performance of his first ever hit, That's All Right Mama. Elvis was back, baby.
Mama, just any way you do it, that's all right. Yeah, that's all right. That's all right now, mama. Any way you do it.
It really was a new lease of life for Elvis, because it had been so many years since he performed. Suddenly it was a new opportunity for Elvis to express himself in an entirely different way he had before. So he had an orchestra behind him, he had a hand-picked band that he called the TCB Band.
Elvis at Vegas started out magnificent. This was Elvis from the late 50s again.
Well, mama, she done told me. Papa done told me too. Sorry, that gal you fooling. Wish she ain't no good for you, but that's all right.
The documentary captures a genuine stage spectacle. Cameras cheek by jowl with Elvis and his band. But the legendary Vegas gigs also gave fans across the globe a chance to finally see their idol in the flesh.
I think the first time we saw him in '72, we were in Vegas for about 4 days, so most people saw him for 8 concerts, me included.
I remember sitting in the audience with my first wife, and she turned around to me and said, as Elvis walked on stage, "It doesn't seem right that he should be there." There was Elvis, and we'd waited all those years.
Tony and Todd had come to Vegas in their capacity as officials of the UK Elvis fan club, which gave them special status, even getting to meet the great man himself. And Tony wasn't even afraid to get up close and personal with the Colonel.
I said to the Colonel, "Can I go on stage and introduce the show?" "Well, Mr. Prince, you want to introduce Elvis? Come with me." Oh, man. So I went out and suddenly got a round of applause. Nobody knew who I was from Adam. And please welcome everybody to the Elvis Presley Show. And then I'm back through the taps. And there on the right-hand side is Elvis in his gear. And he's going like that at me. He's giving me a clap. Wow, the heartbeat, the heartbeat.
The Vegas residency was a huge success, but just like the earlier films, the Colonel's mantra was, if something's worth doing, it's worth overdoing.
It was initially exciting. It's a great showcase. He's got a fantastic band. But that might be something that you do for a year or two and really enjoy it. But to think that you have got to do that for years and years and years. It's the gilded cage, isn't it? Colonel Tom created this, albeit luxurious, prison for Elvis to operate within, and that's what Las Vegas was for him.
During the early 70s, thousands of fans flocked to see the King on tour and in Vegas, and nothing encapsulated this period more than his flamboyant costumes.
It's like it's frozen in time. I'm sitting here wearing the kind of outfit he would wear in the 1970s. And it's extraordinary just how much people still feel that.
And elaborate rhinestone-tastic outfits identified the iconic 70s Elvis look, complemented here by a similarly sparkly and flawlessly passionate rendition of Burning Love from the Aloha from Hawaii special.
At Graceland, one of the halls is just full of Elvis suits, the rhinestones, the capes. It's all there. It's larger than life. And I was standing in front of them and I said to my friend, but this is 1973. He doesn't look that large. It's well shaped. And she said to me, my dear, I think it's been tailored in the years since.
His fashion began to change, and I think that the jumpsuits came in at this point as a way to trick the eye to hide it from his growing waistline.
The Vegas shows were huge, and once again, everyone wanted a piece of Elvis. The pressure to perform was immense.
He started to live in this sort of nocturnal world. He became mentally ill, he became depressed, I think. That's when the drug abuse really started to ramp up.
The disconnection of the performances in the mid-70s from Elvis are in absolute polar opposite to the early stuff, where he's so connected, his body, his voice, it's like he's living it. And then in 76, 77, just before his death, it's like he doesn't even know where he is or what he's doing or why he's even doing it.
Even in this less than energetic performance, there are still brief glimpses of his crowd-pleasing genius. But as he mumbles his way through, it's clear just how far he's fallen.
I almost don't like watching those performances because I feel like I want to remember him at his greatest. But, you know, that's the fullness of a human being's life. It's important that we see those later performances of Elvis and that we understand the pressure that artists face.
By now it was common knowledge he was not the performer he once was. But for fans of the King, nothing would diminish the desire to see the great man.
We went to see Elvis on tour, and by chance it was the last two concerts that Elvis performed. At that time I had been president of the Elvis Presley Fan Club of Great Britain for 10 years. I was to be presented with an award and Elvis presented it to me. It didn't look that bad. It was a bit shaky coming out the plane, but then again, you know, most people would be.
Thinking on his feet, Todd asked a camera crew who were there to film Elvis if they could capture the dream moment.
Nobody got any sound, so everybody said, what did he say? And part of it was, he's standing on my foot. And that's what made Elvis laugh.
This was the last footage ever captured of Elvis Aaron Presley. Elvis's final weeks were spent on the road and back home at his beloved Graceland.
It's a really sad story, his final years. This Graceland was a hellhole, full of these vultures, indulging his every whim, and him just declining.
There was nobody there to say stop. Nobody. And that's the tragedy of it.
They were all yes men around him, you know. He didn't have a Priscilla in his life. She'd have looked after him. She'd have made him behave himself. But He was cocooned by the Memphis Mafia, and unfortunately, he paid the price.
I was watching TV in my cousin's house in Hawaii, and on came a news flash that Elvis had died.
Good evening. Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently,
The somber air of the classic US TV studio reflected the mood of Elvis's fans the world over, all sharing the host's genuine shock and sadness at the devastating news.
Saddest day of my life.
It hit me like a ton of bricks, as it did everyone else.
He was 42 years old. I mean, it's no age, is it? When he died, it was a Kennedy moment, without question.
The amount of people who say to me, "Oh, I remember the day he died." It's extraordinary just how much people still feel that.
I loved him, loved his music. Sure did. And I'm real sad about it.
People call Elvis's death now, they call it a Diana moment. I think it's probably more accurate to say that Diana went through her Elvis moment. In terms of a pop icon, a music legend, we'd never seen anything like it.
Whether you're black or white, whether you're country, redneck or freak, young or old, from Moscow, London or Memphis, Elvis Presley will still be the king of rock and roll to me. He really and truly will. I love him. I really do.
When he died, so dire was the state of his record sales that when a young executive ran into the boss of CBS Records and said, "Boss, boss, boss, terrible news, Elvis has died," the boss turned around and said, "Good career move."
Outside along Elvis Presley Boulevard is where the business starts. Anything to do with Elvis sells.
The huge outpouring of grief at his death was only matched by the huge outpouring of cash fans across the globe spent on anything Elvis, and his popularity has shown no sign of waning.
I remember being at a radio station in 2002, I think it was, and Elvis was back on the playlist.
This remix of a little-known song from the movie Live a Little, Love a Little rebooted Elvis in a slick 21st century mashup with more than a nod to the iconic Jailhouse rock set. The promo also paid homage to the king.
Less conversation, a little more action, please. All this aggravation ain't satisfaction in me. A little more fight, a little less fun. A little less fight, a little more smart. Close your mouth and open up your heart and maybe satisfy me. Satisfy me, baby.
Just another great example, really, of how extraordinary the music is. And you take his voice, you put that on a fader, and you could do anything to it, but at the core of it is the magic of Elvis Presley.
With its catchy bass line, the song became a huge hit, giving Elvis yet another UK #1. But it's his timeless vocals that steal the show.
It's a groovy night and I can show you how to use it. Come along with me and put your mind at ease. Less conversation, a little more action.
Junkie XL's version of A Little Less Conversation just brings Elvis back to life. For me, it feels like he's there again, and he's still the king. In 2016, the Royal Philharmonic Concert Orchestra teamed up with a virtual Elvis, typically dominating proceedings, to showcase some of the King's greatest hits. Slickly entwined with a classical orchestra, his presence still visceral many decades after his passing.
Here was Elvis with a huge orchestra, and it played all over Europe and all over the world.
And thanks to an army of 85,000 Elvis tribute artists worldwide, the legend continues.
The fact that little children, 4 or 5 years old, will come up to me at a show and want my autograph and to say how much they love Elvis and they love his music. He still has such a cultural impact on anyone of any age. I feel like saying to these little kids, how do you know who Elvis is?
Still to this day, so many years after his death, he is one of the most famous people on the planet. He doesn't need a second name. He's Elvis. He's the king.
So here we are, Elvis's greatest moment. Set your sat-nav for Lonely Street.
It was the Big Bang, really. That was when it happened for everybody. Everything that came after, from the Beatles to Hendrix to Bob Dylan, it started with Heartbreak Hotel.
Well, since my baby left me, well, I found a new place to dwell. Well, it's down at the end of Lonely Street, that Heartbreak Hotel.
With its staccato guitar and echoey, undulating vocal, the song was like nothing that had gone before. It made listeners hang on every seductively phrased word.
Though it's always crowded, you still can find some room for broken-hearted lovers to cry there in the gloom.
It has a sort of ghostly quality, Elvis's vocal on that. They actually had Elvis standing in sort of a stone corridor singing his vocals. So the song is slightly haunting. Not in a scary way, but it is haunting in its feeling.
Their hearts tears keep flowing, the desk clerks dressed in black. Well, they've been so long on the street, they'll never look back and think of so.
And God only knows what it was like hearing it at the time. It's like a surreal act. It's an act of surrealism, that piece of music, if you consider when it came out and what was happening around it at the time.
What you are listening to in 2 minutes and a few seconds is the creation of a generation gap. Before the needle goes on, music is all about for everybody. We all listen to Sinatra. By the end of that record, if you're under 21 years old, you don't listen to that stuff anymore at all. You're listening to this now.
Although it's always crowded.
Elvis's now legendary appearance on national US TV in 1956 saw a moodily lit king enthralling his audience at home and in the studio with his mesmerizingly simple and direct performance.
The arrangement is so tight and perfect and beautiful. Just a little splash of piano in it, but mostly it's just those three guys playing together. It's actually giving me goosebumps right now thinking about it. Paul McCartney famously considers it one of the key artistic statements of the 20th century. If that's what the Beatles think, you know, it's going to be pretty hard to argue with from a musical perspective.
That was Elvis and his originality. He never copied anyone. He was influenced by everything, but he was a complete original, and I love him for that.
Having worked the crowd to a frenzy, Elvis then takes them over the edge with his orgasmic trademark moves. Finishing off with a snarling vocal loaded with rebellious attitude. It's a performance worthy of a king.
You'll be so lonely, you could die.
Heartbreak Hotel was the birth and the inspiration of rock music as we know it, of music as we know it, and everything came from that. Everything.
Tomorrow night, meet Mike and Jess. Like more of us these days, they work from home. Adults only, porn star parents. Tomorrow at 10. Next, Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson are living it up as Mr. and Mrs. Grey, but for how long? 50 Shades Freed in just a moment.